She boarded that stagecoach with a knife hidden in her sleeve, because the last woman who married a stranger in Texas came back with her arm in a sling and her eyes emptied of everything that once made them bright. Priscilla had heard every horror story. Brides who vanished into the frontier and were never seen again. She was ready for a monster. But when she stepped off that coach in a dusty nowhere town called Bandra, the man waiting for her was holding wilted wildflowers with shaking hands, and a smile so nervous it looked like it might shatter if she didn't take them. She almost trusted him. Then a single gunshot echoed across the ridge, and the man beside her disappeared behind his own eyes. 10 seconds of absolute emptiness, as if someone had blown out every candle inside him. That night, she heard him screaming from the barn, and in his dresser drawer, she found a wedding ring engraved with another woman's name, the woman who warned her in Charleston. Could it be the same one who once called this house home? You're listening to Cowboy Dusk channel, where the frontier holds no fairy tales, just raw love stories written in dust and gun smoke, where broken people ride west hoping the land is wide enough to outrun what haunts them. This story reminds us that the people who deserve love the most are often the ones too damaged to ask for it, and that real trust isn't built by hiding your scars. It's built the moment someone sees them all and chooses to stay. If this story found its way to your heart, do me a favor. Hit like so it can find someone else who needs it. Leave a comment and tell me, would you have stayed or would you have run? Share this with someone who's been through the fire and came out still believing. And if this is your first time here, subscribe and tap that bell, because at Cowboy Dusk, every sunset brings a new story worth staying for.
The last woman who warned Priscilla about marrying a stranger had come back to Charleston with her arm in a sling and her eyes emptied of everything that once made them bright. "Do not ever trust a Texas man," she had said, standing on the steps of the Methodist church with her voice flat as creek water in August. Priscilla had written those words in the margin of her Bible with a pencil that trembled in her fingers. Then she had packed her only carpetbag, sold her mother's cameo brooch for $11 and boarded the stagecoach anyway, because the alternative was worse. The stagecoach lurched to a halt in front of a weathered general store, and Priscilla Montgomery pressed her gloved hand against her stomach and willed herself not to be sick. 300 miles of rutted roads and broken axles and dust so thick she could taste it in her teeth. And now here she was. Bandra, Texas. The end of the civilized world, or the beginning of something she did not yet have the courage to name. Through the window she could see the town laid out like bleached bones scattered across the prairie. 2 saloons with swinging doors, a church with a crooked steeple, a mercantile with a porch that sagged in the middle like a tired horse. Heat shimmered off the dirt street in waves she could actually see, bending the air, making everything look like it might be a dream or a hallucination, or both. Somewhere in this place was the man who had purchased her future with 3 letters and a stagecoach ticket. She reached inside her left sleeve and felt the handle of the small folding knife she had hidden there before leaving Charleston. It was not much of a weapon. The blade was barely 3 inches long and had been designed for opening correspondence, not defending a woman's life. But it was all she had, and she had made herself a promise on the first night of the journey, somewhere between Columbia and Atlanta. When the darkness outside the coach windows was so complete, it felt like being swallowed. If Thomas Irving turned out to be a monster, she would not go quietly. She had heard the stories. Every woman who answered a matrimonial advertisement had heard them. Brides arriving to find their husbands were drunkards or gamblers, or men whose fists spoke louder than their voices ever did. Women who vanished into the frontier and were never heard from again. One woman in the boarding house where Priscilla spent her last night in Charleston had told her about a girl from Savannah who had traveled to a mining town in Colorado and been found 3 months later at the bottom of a ravine. They called it an accident. Nobody believed it. Priscilla had listened to every warning. She had cataloged every horror story with the same meticulous attention she had once given to her father's account books. and she had come anyway. Because 6 months ago, William Montgomery, her father, bookkeeper for Hargrove and Associates, had been caught stealing. $3,200 over 6 years, skimmed from client accounts with the careful precision of a man who understood numbers better than he understood morality. The newspaper printed his name on a Tuesday morning. By Wednesday morning, Priscilla had found him hanging from the ceiling beam in his office, his shoes still polished, his cravat still neatly knotted, because William Montgomery was a man who cared about appearances right up to the very end. She remembered the flies. That was the detail that lived in her nightmares. Not the sight of him suspended there, not the angle of his neck, but the sound of the flies that had already found him, buzzing in the silence of the room with an industriousness that seemed obscene. After that, everything collapsed. The debts consumed the house and every stick of furniture inside it. Her mother had been dead since Priscilla was 14, which meant at 22 years of age she found herself alone in the world with no family, no prospects, a last name that had become a synonym for shame, and the terrible knowledge that she had lived under the same roof as a thief for 6 years and never seen it. That was the part that ate at her, not the poverty, not the humiliation, the blindness. She had kept her father's personal ledgers since she was 16. She had a gift for numbers, could spot an error in a column of figures the way some people could spot a hawk in a cloudless sky. And she had not seen what he was doing. Or worse, she had seen the signs and chosen not to question them, because questioning them would have meant admitting that the man she loved and trusted most in the world was a liar. She would never make that mistake again. She would never trust her own judgment about a person without evidence, without proof, without the kind of verification that left no room for sentiment to cloud the truth. The stagecoach driver opened the door, and Texas heat rolled in like something alive. Priscilla gathered her carpetbag, the one piece of luggage that contained everything she still owned in the world, and stepped down onto the dirt street of Bandra. Her black traveling dress began to suffocate her immediately. She had worn it for mourning, though the official period had ended 2 months ago. Somehow, wearing colors had seemed presumptuous for a mail-order bride traveling across the country to marry a stranger. Black felt appropriate. Black felt honest. She straightened her spine, adjusted her bonnet, and began studying every face she could see with the intensity of a woman who would not be caught unaware again. Across the street, Thomas Irving had been standing in the same spot for 3 hours. He was not aware of the exact number. He had stopped counting after the first hour when the heat had wilted the flowers in his hand, past the point of looking intentional, and into the territory of looking pitiful. Purple verbena and white Blackfoot daisies tied together with a strip of leather he had cut from an old bridle. He had picked them that morning from the meadow south of the house, choosing each stem with more care than he had given to any task in recent memory. And now they were drooping in the heat, and he was standing here like a fool holding a bouquet that looked like something a child would bring home to his mother. He should have bought proper flowers. There was a woman in San Antonio who sold hothouse roses, and he could have ridden there yesterday and been back by evening. But roses felt like a lie. Roses said, "I'm the kind of man who buys expensive things for women," and he was not that man. He was the kind of man who grew things with his own hands and hoped they were good enough, and if they were not, well, at least they were honest. His hands were shaking again. He gripped the flower stems tighter, using the pressure to still the tremor that had plagued him since Chickamauga. 15 years since that September morning in the Georgia woods, and his body still remembered what his mind had spent every waking hour trying to forget. The shaking was worst in the mornings, and when he was anxious, and right now he was more anxious than he had been since the day he had walked into a union recruitment office at 16 years old and lied about his age, because a war seemed like a grand adventure, and he was too young and too stupid to know any better. The stagecoach door opened. A woman in black stepped down. She was smaller than he had expected. Not delicate exactly, but compact, as though she had learned to take up as little space in the world as possible. Her face was pale beneath the bonnet, with dark eyes that moved across the street with the sharp focus of someone cataloging every detail. Those eyes were not afraid, he realized. They were assessing, measuring, looking for the thing that would give her a reason to run. He recognized that look. He wore it himself some mornings when he caught his reflection in the wash basin and tried to decide if the man staring back at him was someone worth knowing. She was beautiful in a way that hurt him, not the bright, obvious beauty of a saloon girl or the cultivated prettiness of a shopkeeper's daughter, but something quieter and more complicated. A beauty that had survived hard things and was still standing, but only just. She was wearing mourning clothes. His chest tightened with recognition that was almost physical in its force. She had lost someone. She knew the weight of grief, the way it sat on your shoulders like a yoke you could never quite set down. He knew that weight. He carried it every single day. Thomas made himself walk toward her. His legs felt like they belonged to someone else. And for a terrible moment, he was afraid one of the episodes would take him right here in the middle of the street. And this woman who had traveled 300 miles to meet him would arrive to find her future husband standing slack-jawed and empty-eyed like a man whose soul had left his body. But the episode did not come. He made it across the street. He stood before her, and the first thing she did was look at his hands, at the wilted flowers trembling in his grip, and he watched her expression shift through something he could not quite read. "Miss Montgomery," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. She looked up at him. He was tall, over 6 feet, and she had to tilt her chin to meet his eyes. He saw her register his size, saw the quick calculation in her dark gaze. "I am Thomas Irving," he said, and then he smiled, and the smile was the most honest thing about him because it was nervous and unpracticed and completely without guile. He held out the flowers. "These are for you. They are verbena and blackfoot daisies. I know they are not much. They grow wild all over my property, and I thought maybe you might like to know what kind of place you are coming to." The verbena petals were curling at the edges from the heat. One of the daisy stems had snapped where he had been gripping it too tightly. He was suddenly and acutely aware that he looked like a fool, standing in the dirt with broken flowers and a smile that probably made him look simple. Priscilla stared at him, then at the flowers, then back at his face. She had prepared herself for many things on this journey. She had prepared for cruelty, for indifference, for the cold assessment of a man evaluating livestock at auction. She had steeled herself against the possibility that Thomas Irving would look at her the way men sometimes looked at women they had purchased, as property, as function, as something less than human. She had not prepared herself for a nervous man holding wilted wildflowers with shaking hands and a smile that looked like it might break if she did not accept them. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, and she did not know why her eyes were stinging. She reached out and took the bouquet, and her fingers brushed against his calloused ones for just a moment, and Thomas flinched backward. Not a big motion. Just one quick step, reflexive, involuntary, as though the contact had triggered something he had not expected, as though he was not accustomed to being touched, or as though he was afraid of what might happen when he was. Priscilla noticed. She filed it away. She did not understand it yet. He helped her onto the wagon, and as he took her hand to steady her on the step, his sleeve rode up and she saw it. A scar running from his wrist to his elbow, pale against his tanned skin, too clean and too straight to be a ranching injury. A blade had done that, or shrapnel, something that tore flesh with precision rather than accident. Thomas saw her looking and pulled his sleeve down fast, and the gesture was so quick and so panicked that it told her more than any explanation could have. He had secrets. She had expected that. Every person who advertised for a spouse through the matrimonial papers was running from something or towards something, and usually both at once. But the nature of his secrets felt different from what she had feared. A violent man did not flinch away from touch. A cruel man did not bring wildflowers. She did not know what to make of him, and for a woman who had trained herself to read people like ledger entries, that uncertainty was more frightening than any confirmed threat. They rolled out of town on a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 well-groomed horses. The road stretched ahead through scrubland and scattered live oaks, and the heat pressed down on everything with the weight of a physical thing. Thomas cleared his throat. "There is something I ought to tell you before we go any further." Priscilla's pulse jumped. Here it comes, she thought. The confession. The catch. The reason a seemingly decent man had to advertise across the country for a wife instead of courting one of the available women within 100 miles. But before Thomas could speak, a gunshot cracked from the western ridge. The sound was distant, probably a hunter or a rancher scaring off coyotes, nothing unusual in the Texas hill country. A flock of birds erupted from the tree line and scattered across the sky like thrown gravel. Thomas went rigid, his hands locked on the reins so tight his knuckles turned white as bone. His eyes emptied, not closed, not averted. Empty, as though someone had reached inside him and blown out every candle. His face lost all expression, all life, all connection to the present moment. He was there on the wagon seat beside her, but he was also somewhere else entirely. Somewhere she could not follow, somewhere that the sound of a single gunshot had sent him like a stone dropped into deep water. 10 seconds. That was how long it lasted. 10 seconds during which Priscilla sat beside a man who had vanished from behind his own eyes, and the horses kept walking because the reins were locked in fists that had nothing to do with driving and everything to do with survival, and the dust swirled around the wagon wheels, and the Texas sun beat down on two strangers who were about to become husband and wife. And Priscilla Montgomery understood for the first time that the man she had agreed to marry was carrying something far more dangerous than cruelty. Then Thomas blinked. His hands loosened. Color came back to his face in a slow, uneven flush, and he drew a breath that sounded like a man breaking the surface after being held underwater. "Sorry," he said. His voice was hoarse. "What was I saying?" Priscilla looked at him for a long moment. "You were going to tell me something." Thomas stared at the road ahead. His jaw worked like he was chewing on words that would not come out. Then he shook his head. "It can wait," he said. "Wait. Let me get you home first." Priscilla clutched her bouquet of wilted wildflowers and said nothing. But inside, the bookkeeper's mind was already at work, arranging what she had seen into columns and categories, searching for the entry that would make the ledger balance. The shaking hands, the scar, the flinch from human touch, the empty eyes, and the 10 seconds of absence. She did not have enough information yet, but she was paying attention. And she would not stop paying attention until she understood exactly what kind of man had bought her a stagecoach ticket and greeted her with flowers and a smile that she was beginning to suspect was the bravest thing he did all day. The house was clean in a way that unsettled her. Not the cleanliness of a man preparing for a guest, but the cleanliness of someone who needed to control every surface around him because he could not control what happened inside. Priscilla stood in the doorway of the small limestone and timber house and let her eyes do what they always did. Catalog, assess, look for the thing that did not belong. The floors were scrubbed so thoroughly they still smelled of lye soap. The furniture, what little there was, had been arranged with almost military precision. A table with 4 chairs, each one exactly the same distance from its neighbor. A rocking chair positioned beside the window at an angle that suggested someone had measured it. A stone fireplace on the far wall with a mantel that held nothing. No photographs, no keepsakes, no evidence that a human being with a history and memories and attachments to other people had ever lived here. But the walls told a different story. Priscilla's eyes found the nail holes immediately. 4 of them, evenly spaced on the wall above the fireplace, where pictures or frames had once hung. Someone had removed them. Recently, judging by the small circles of lighter wood where the frames had protected the timber from years of smoke and sun. Something or someone had been erased from this house. On the table sat a jar of wildflowers. Purple verbena and white blackfoot daisies, the same species as the bouquet he had given her. They were fresh, which meant he had picked them this morning, which meant he had placed them here before driving to town to meet her stage. She imagined him standing at this table in the early light, arranging flowers in a jar with the same careful attention he had given to scrubbing the floors, and the image was so unexpectedly tender that she had to look away. Thomas stood behind her, hat in his hands, watching her take in his home with an expression that hovered between pride and terror. "The bedroom is through there," he said, gesturing to a doorway on the right. "I have been sleeping out in the barn the last few nights to give you privacy until we are properly married. I thought we could see Reverend Matthews tomorrow, if that suits you." Priscilla nodded and walked toward the bedroom. The bed was covered in white sheets stretched tight as a drumhead. Military corners. She had seen beds made this way at the Veterans Hospital in Charleston, where she had volunteered briefly after the war. Men who had served learned to make beds a certain way, and the habit stayed with them for life, like a scar on muscle memory. On the headboard, she noticed a dent in the wood, a fist-shaped depression about 3 inches across, the grain splintered outward from the point of impact. Someone had hit the headboard hard enough to break the surface. Not a kick, not an accidental bump. A blow delivered with force and intention, or force without intention, which somehow seemed worse. She added it to the ledger in her mind. The nail holes, the empty mantel, the military bed, the dent in the headboard, the shaking hands and the empty eyes and the flinch from human touch. She was building a portrait of Thomas Irving, one detail at a time, and the picture forming was not the one she had expected. She had expected cruelty and found wildflowers. Now she was beginning to wonder if the truth was something more complicated than either. That evening, Thomas cooked supper. He prepared enough food for 5 people, maybe 6. Beans and salt pork and cornbread and fried potatoes and a pan of biscuits that were better than Priscilla expected from a man living alone. He served the food with a quiet efficiency that spoke of long practice, piling her plate high before filling his own, and when she commented that there was enough to feed a bunkhouse full of cowboys, something flickered across his face that was gone before she could name it. They ate across the table from each other, and the conversation moved like 2 people learning to dance, each one testing the other's rhythm, trying not to step on anything that might break. Thomas asked about Charleston. Priscilla told him about the city, the harbor, the way the air smelled of salt and magnolia in spring. She told him her father had been a bookkeeper who passed away 6 months ago, and the debts had taken everything. She told him her mother had died when she was 14. She did not tell him about the embezzlement. She did not tell him about the hanging. She did not tell him that she had found the body, or that the sound of flies still woke her from sleep on bad nights. She edited her history the way a careful bookkeeper edits a ledger, removing the entries that would raise questions she was not ready to answer. Thomas listened and nodded, and asked small, careful questions that showed he was paying attention. Then he told her about the ranch. 200 acres with good grass and a creek that ran year-round. 50 head of cattle, a few horses, chickens. He had built the house himself 4 years ago. His father had been a carpenter in Missouri and had taught him to work with wood before he passed. He did not mention the war. He did not mention a previous wife. He did not explain the scar on his arm or the shaking hands or the 10 seconds of absence on the wagon. He offered her a version of himself as carefully curated as the scrubbed floors and the arranged furniture, and Priscilla recognized the editing because she was doing exactly the same thing. 2 liars sitting across a table, she thought, each one telling the truth about everything except the thing that mattered most. After supper, she washed the dishes while Thomas dried them, and their movements found a rhythm that felt oddly natural, as though their bodies understood a partnership their minds had not yet agreed to. When their hands touched over a wet plate, Thomas pulled away first. He always pulled away first. She was beginning to understand that this was not indifference, but something closer to fear. That night, unable to sleep in the too-clean bed with the dent in the headboard, Priscilla wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped onto the porch. Thomas was already there. He sat in the rocking chair with his back to the door, and he did not hear her approach because he was somewhere else. Not the empty-eyed absence she had witnessed on the wagon. This was different. He was present but unguarded, and what she saw stopped her in the doorway with one hand on the frame. He was crying, not loudly, not dramatically. He cried the way a man cries who has had years of practice hiding it, with his shoulders hunched and his jaw clenched and his whole body rigid with the effort of keeping the sound contained. The moonlight caught the tracks on his face, silver against the tan, and his hands gripped the arms of the rocking chair with the same white-knuckled force he had used on the reins. Priscilla retreated before he could hear her. She eased the door closed and stood in the dark main room with her heart hammering and her mind racing, rearranging every piece of information she had gathered since stepping off that stagecoach. A man who cooked too much food, who cleaned with military precision, who flinched from touch and shook when he was anxious and disappeared behind his own eyes when a gun fired, who had erased someone from the walls of his house and cried alone on his porch in the dark, like a man carrying a grief so heavy he could only set it down when he believed no one was watching. She climbed back into bed and lay staring at the ceiling. Her mind worked the way it always did when something did not balance, turning the numbers over, looking for the hidden entry, the misplaced figure, the lie buried in the honest columns. She could not find it, not yet, and the not knowing made her feel exactly the way she had felt the night before her father's name had appeared in the Charleston papers. Certain that something was wrong, unable to prove it, afraid to trust the instinct that was screaming at her because the last time she had trusted that instinct, she had been wrong about the most important person in her life. While clearing the table earlier, she had opened a drawer looking for a dishcloth and found something that she had not mentioned to Thomas. A letter, unsent, in his handwriting, which she recognized from the correspondence they had exchanged. The opening line read, "Dear Margaret, I know you do not want to hear from me, but..." The rest had been torn away, the paper ripped raggedly, as though someone had started to destroy it and then changed their mind, or lost the will to finish. Margaret. Not a name Thomas had mentioned, not in his letters to her, not in their conversations today. A ghost in a drawer, joining the ghosts on the walls where pictures used to hang and the ghost in the dent on the headboard. "Who are you, Thomas Irving?" she whispered into the dark room. "And what happened to Margaret?" The answer came at 3 in the morning, though not the answer she was looking for. Priscilla was jolted from a thin sleep by screaming. Not from outside, from the barn. Thomas's voice, but nothing like the voice she knew. This was raw and ragged and primal, the sound of a man trapped inside something that had no walls and no doors and no way out. He was screaming words she could not make out. And between the words were sounds that were worse than words, sounds that belonged to a battlefield or a slaughterhouse, not a barn on a quiet ranch in the Texas Hill Country on a summer night when the only things that should have been making noise were the crickets and the coyotes. Priscilla sat up in bed. Her hand found the folding knife under her pillow by reflex. Then she realized what she was hearing and let the knife fall. This was not a threat. This was torment. She stood at the bedroom window and looked toward the barn and listened to the man she was going to marry tomorrow screaming his way through a nightmare that sounded like the end of the world, and she did not know whether to run toward it or away from it. And so she stood there doing neither, while the screaming went on until it finally dissolved into a silence that was somehow even worse. Thomas woke with the taste of blood in his mouth. He had bitten through his lip during the nightmare again, a ragged tear on the inside of his lower lip that he could feel with his tongue, and the copper taste was so familiar it almost felt like home. The first thing he thought about was not the battle at Chickamauga. It was not Elijah Cooper catching a mini ball in the throat and making that sound, that wet, choking sound that Thomas would hear in his sleep until the day he died. The first thing he thought about was whether Priscilla had heard him. He lay on the straw pallet he had made in the barn loft and stared at the rafters, and took a careful inventory of his body the way Doc Caldwell had taught him. Hands. Check. They were shaking, but they always shook in the mornings. Jaw. Sore from clenching. Lip. Bleeding, but not badly. Heart rate. Slowing. Coming back down from wherever it had been during the hours when his body relived things his waking mind refused to remember. He was 16 when he enlisted. 16 years old, standing in a recruitment office in Springfield, Missouri, telling the officer behind the desk that he was 18, with the confidence of a boy who genuinely believed that war was an adventure story that happened to other people's sons. His father had begged him not to go. His mother had cried. His sister Mary, 2 years younger, had called him a fool, and she had been right. But he had gone anyway because he was 16 and immortal, and the Union needed soldiers, and he was going to be a hero. Chickamauga disabused him of that notion in approximately 4 hours. He did not remember the battle in sequence. He remembered it in fragments, shards of sensation that floated up from the deep water of his memory at unpredictable intervals and pulled him under. The smell of gunpowder so thick it coated the inside of his nose. The grass in the Georgia woods, impossibly green beneath all the red. Elijah Cooper's hand gripping Thomas's sleeve, then releasing, the weight of a body going still in his arms. The sound, always the sound. Thomas sat up, swung his legs over the edge of the loft, and forced himself to breathe. In through the nose, 4 counts. Hold, 4 counts. Out through the mouth, 4 counts. Doc Caldwell said this helped calm the nerves, something to do with the body's animal response to danger. Thomas did not understand the science. He only knew that some mornings the breathing worked and some mornings it did not, and on the mornings when it did not work, the best he could do was clench his jaw and get through the day without anyone seeing him break. He climbed down from the loft, pumped water from the well, washed his face, and looked at his reflection in the horse trough. The scar on his arm caught the early light, a pale line running from wrist to elbow where a Confederate bayonet had laid him open at Missionary Ridge. He pulled his sleeve down quickly, an old habit, and went to the house to make breakfast. He was determined to be normal today. Today was the day he would marry Priscilla Montgomery, and he would stand before God and Reverend Matthews and promise to honor and cherish this woman, and he would mean every word. And he would not think about the fact that he was also a man who screamed in his sleep and sometimes could not remember where he was, and had once fractured his wife's arm without waking up. His first wife, Margaret. The thought of her name was a stone in his chest. He had loved Margaret Calloway with the desperate gratitude of a broken man who could not believe someone so whole would choose him. They had married in 1874, 5 years after the war ended, and for 2 years their life together had been good. Better than good. She had laughed easily, and her laugh was the only sound in the world that could drown out the ones in his head. Then the nightmares got worse. The episodes came more frequently, triggered by sounds, by smells, by shadows that moved in ways that reminded his sleeping body of things his waking mind refused to name. He would lash out in his sleep, fighting enemies that were not there, and Margaret would have to retreat to the far side of the bed or sometimes to another room entirely, until the night she was not fast enough. He did not remember doing it. That was the worst part. He had fallen asleep holding her, and he had woken up alone, and he had found her in the kitchen with her left arm cradled against her chest and her face white with pain, and a look in her eyes that he would never forget as long as he lived. It was not anger. It was not even fear. It was the death of something. The moment when a woman realizes that the man she loves is also the man she needs to get away from. She left the next morning, packed her things without a word, hired a wagon to take her to San Antonio, and was gone before noon. He never saw her again. He heard through the gossip channels that connect small towns to the larger world that she had returned east and told people he was violent, and he could not argue with that characterization because it was true. Even if the violence was committed by a version of himself, he could neither control nor remember. After Margaret left, Thomas had 3 choices: drink himself to death, which held a certain appeal, sell the ranch and disappear, or place an advertisement in the matrimonial papers and try again, this time without telling the truth about what he was, because telling the truth had a success rate of 0, and he was so lonely he thought it might actually kill him. He chose the advertisement. He wrote to Priscilla Montgomery 3 times, neat, careful letters that said everything about his ranch and his work ethic and his desire for a family, and nothing about the war or Margaret or the fact that the man inviting her to share his life was the kind of man who could hurt a woman in his sleep and not even know he had done it. He hated himself for the deception. He also knew that without it, she never would have come. Thomas set the breakfast table and brewed coffee and waited for Priscilla to emerge from the bedroom, and when she did, wearing a simple gray cotton dress that had seen better days, he searched her face for any sign that she had heard him screaming in the barn last night. She met his eyes calmly and said good morning and asked if there was coffee, and he could not tell whether she was hiding what she knew or genuinely unaware, and the uncertainty was its own kind of torment. They rode into Bandra in the mid-morning light. The town was small enough that their arrival at the church drew immediate attention. Priscilla felt the eyes on her from every window and doorway. The mail-order bride. The most interesting piece of gossip this town had seen in months. Reverend Matthews was a thin man in his 50s with kind eyes and hands that had clearly done real work before they took up the Bible. He received them in the small church on the edge of town, a wooden structure with handmade pews and a cross fashioned from mesquite wood. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house served as witnesses. Mrs. Henderson was a woman in her 40s with a warm face and sharp eyes, and she embraced Priscilla like a long-lost daughter before the ceremony. "Oh, honey," she said, "you are even prettier than Thomas described. He has been checking the stage schedule every single day for a week." Thomas looked embarrassed but did not deny it. The ceremony was brief. Reverend Matthews read from his worn Bible and asked them to speak their vows. Thomas's voice trembled as he promised to honor and cherish. And Priscilla realized it was not emotion alone. He was fighting something, holding something down with every word he spoke, the way a man holds a door shut against a storm. When the Reverend said Thomas could kiss his bride, Thomas leaned toward her and stopped. 1 inch from her mouth, his green eyes searching hers, asking permission with a vulnerability that was almost painful to witness. He was giving her a way out. Even now, even in front of the Reverend and the Hendersons, he was letting her decide. Priscilla closed the distance. She kissed him first. It was brief and chaste and tasted faintly of coffee. And when she pulled back, Thomas's cheeks were flushed and his eyes were bright with something that looked dangerous like hope. Mrs. Henderson pulled Priscilla aside as they were leaving. "He is a good man, honey, but everybody carries scars. Be patient with him." She squeezed Priscilla's hand and let her go, and the words landed in Priscilla's mind with the weight of something important that she did not yet understand. On the ride home, they passed a tall man on horseback, who tipped his hat to Thomas, and then looked at Priscilla with a frank, assessing curiosity. This was Hector Garza, Thomas's foreman, a weathered vaquero in his 60s, whose face looked like it had been carved from the same limestone that dotted the hills. Hector had worked the land since before Thomas arrived, and the look he gave Priscilla was simultaneously welcoming and evaluating, like a man trying to determine whether a new horse had the stamina for the work ahead. "Senora Irving," Hector said, and the formal address made the marriage feel suddenly real. "Welcome, thank you," Priscilla said. Hector rode beside the wagon for a while, talking to Thomas about the cattle and the fence line that needed repair. Then he mentioned, almost in passing, that his son Luis had been gone 6 months now. "Found work elsewhere," Hector said, and his voice when he said it carried a bitter edge that Priscilla filed away with all the other details she was collecting. "Left the ranch for better pay. Cannot blame a young man for wanting more." Thomas nodded sympathetically, but Priscilla noticed that Hector did not look at Thomas when he said it. He looked at the horizon, the way people look at things they do not want to see. In town, as they had passed through, Priscilla had noticed something else. Sheriff Roy Mitchell, a grizzled man with a badge that caught the sunlight, was standing outside the saloon talking to a large man on horseback. The large man said something and Mitchell laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. It was a familiar gesture, comfortable, casual, the kind of contact that happens between friends, not between a lawman and a citizen he barely knows. Priscilla did not know who the large man was, but she noted the interaction the way she noted everything else. The bookkeeper's mind never stopped working. That evening, while Thomas tended to the horses, Priscilla unpacked her few belongings into the bedroom dresser. She opened the bottom drawer and found something that stopped her cold. A woman's wedding ring. Gold, simple, worn smooth from years of contact with skin. She turned it in her fingers and read the engraving on the inside of the band. T&M, 1874. Thomas and Margaret. 5 years before Priscilla arrived. Thomas Irving had been married before, and he had not told her. She placed the ring back in the drawer exactly where she had found it, and closed the drawer carefully and stood in the center of the bedroom with her hands pressed flat against her stomach, breathing the way her father had taught her to breathe when the numbers did not add up. Slow and steady. Do not panic. Follow the evidence. Follow the nail holes on the wall where pictures had been removed, the unsent letter to a woman named Margaret, the ring engraved with initials and a date, a previous marriage that Thomas had not mentioned in his letters, had not mentioned in their conversations, had not mentioned in his vows before God. She had asked herself who Margaret was. Now she knew. Margaret was a wife, a first wife, a wife who had left or been driven away or disappeared, and whose existence Thomas had hidden with the same careful precision he used to align the chairs and scrub the floors. Priscilla sat on the edge of the bed. She did not feel betrayed, not yet. She felt something colder than betrayal. She felt the familiar sickening lurch of recognition that came from discovering that a person she was beginning to trust had been editing the truth. She had felt this lurch before. She had felt it the morning the newspaper published her father's name. The last time a man she trusted had hidden something important from her, the revelation had destroyed her entire life. She would not let that happen again. That night, Thomas lay beside her in the bed for the first time. Not touching. A careful 12 inches of white sheet between them. A no-man's land that both of them were afraid to cross. The darkness pressed against the windows, and the sounds of the Texas night drifted in through the cracks, crickets, and coyotes, and the soft breathing of a man who was not asleep. "I need to tell you something," Thomas whispered. His voice was so quiet she almost did not hear it. "I am not the man you think I am." Priscilla held her breath. The bedroom was dark and still, and the moment felt balanced on a knife's edge, and she knew that whatever he said next could change everything. But before he could speak, the dogs erupted into frantic barking outside. Thomas sat up fast, the way a man sits up who has spent years sleeping with one ear open for trouble. Through the window, Priscilla saw it. Fire. Red and orange against the black sky, rising from the direction of the barn with a hungry roar that she could hear even through the walls. The barn was burning. Fire has its own language. Not the cheerful crackle of a hearth on a cold evening. Not the controlled burn of a cook stove doing its daily work. This was something else. This was the starving roar of destruction, the sound of something alive and hungry consuming everything in its path. Thomas was out the door before Priscilla had fully registered what was happening. She grabbed her shoes, shoved her feet into them without lacing, and ran after him into the yard. The barn was engulfed on the east side, flames climbing the timber walls with terrifying speed, orange light throwing wild shadows across the ground. The horses were screaming inside. The sound cut through the roar of the fire like a blade, high and desperate, an animal in its terror. Thomas stood 20 feet from the barn doors and did not move. He was not watching the fire. He was somewhere else. His body was present, planted in the dirt yard with his arms at his sides, and his hands opening and closing on nothing, but his eyes were the same empty windows Priscilla had seen on the wagon when the gunshot cracked across the ridge. He was gone, pulled under, trapped inside whatever hell the fire had dragged him back to. The horses screamed again. Priscilla did not think. She ran past Thomas, past his frozen body and his empty eyes, and she hit the barn doors with her shoulder and threw them open. Smoke poured out in a black wave that seared her lungs and blinded her. She dropped low the way she had read you were supposed to do in a fire, and crawled toward the stalls. Copper, Thomas's chestnut gelding, was rearing and slamming against the stall door. Priscilla fumbled with the latch, her fingers clumsy with panic, and the latch stuck because the metal was already hot, and she burned her palm getting it open. Copper bolted past her so close she felt the wind of his body. She scrambled to the next stall. Belle, the gentler mare, was pressed against the far wall, eyes white with terror, refusing to move. Priscilla grabbed Belle's halter and pulled. The horse would not budge. A beam groaned overhead, showering sparks. Priscilla pulled harder, leaning back with all her weight, screaming words at the horse that were not really words, but just sound, just desperation given voice. Belle lunged forward. Her shoulder caught Priscilla square in the chest and sent her sprawling. Priscilla hit the ground hard, pain exploding through her left side, and for a moment the world went white. Then Belle was over her and past her and out the door, and Priscilla was lying on the floor of a burning barn with smoke pressing down on her like a smothering blanket. She crawled. 3 feet. 5 feet. 10. Her hands found the door frame and she pulled herself through just as Hector arrived on horseback, already shouting, already swinging down from the saddle with a blanket to beat at the flames. Together they fought the fire. Priscilla hauled buckets from the well until her arms screamed. Hector worked with the grim efficiency of a man who had fought fires on the range before. They could not save the east wall, but they saved the structure. They saved the hay. They saved the tack room with the saddles and bridles and the tools Thomas needed to run his ranch. Thomas came back to himself about 10 minutes in. Priscilla saw the moment it happened, the way life flooded back into his eyes like water filling a dry well, and the first thing he saw was Priscilla, soot-covered and panting with burns on her palm, and a bruise already darkening on her shoulder where Belle had struck her. The shame on his face was terrible. Worse than the fire, worse than the burns, worse than anything Priscilla had seen on another human being. It was the shame of a man who knew he had failed at the only moment that mattered, and he could not hide it because his face had never learned to lie the way his words had. He did not say anything. He took the bucket from her hands and went to work fighting what was left of the fire, and he worked with a ferocity that was almost frightening, as though he could burn away his failure through sheer effort. After the fire was out and the animals were secured and the first gray light of dawn was beginning to soften the eastern horizon, Hector found something near the back wall of the barn. Rags, soaked in kerosene, stuffed into a gap between 2 boards where the fire had burned hottest. This was no accident, Hector said. His face was stone. Thomas looked at the rags, and then looked at the barn, and then looked at Priscilla, and something hardened in his expression. "Someone set this fire," he said, "on purpose, on my land, on the night I brought my wife home." The word wife landed in the space between them with a weight that surprised Priscilla. He had said it with a possessive ferocity that was nothing like the shy, trembling man who had handed her wildflowers at the stagecoach stop. This was something else. This was the animal underneath, the one that had been to war and come back with enough broken pieces to fill a barn. Priscilla sat on an overturned bucket and let Thomas tend to her shoulder. His hands were gentle, precise, surprisingly practiced at treating minor injuries. But his eyes would not meet hers. He knew she had seen him freeze. He knew she had fought the fire alone while he stood in the yard like a man made of stone. He was waiting for her to ask. She did not ask. Instead, she said, "A burned barn can be rebuilt. I want to know who lit the match." Thomas looked at her then, really looked at her. And something shifted in his green eyes, something that was not gratitude and not relief, but was deeper than either, a recognition that the woman sitting before him was not going to shatter at the first sign of trouble. "I have an idea who it was," he said, "but I need to be sure before I act." "Then be sure," Priscilla said, "and be sure quickly." Later that day, while Thomas rode the property to check for additional damage, Priscilla overheard a conversation she was not supposed to hear. Hector and Thomas, talking in low voices outside the tack room. "You have to tell her," Hector said. His voice was quiet, but insistent. "About the war, about Margaret, about all of it. If she finds out from someone else, you will lose her. Same as last time." Thomas's response was too low for Priscilla to catch, but Hector's was not. "She is not Margaret," the old vaquero said. "I have watched her for 1 day and I can see that. She ran into a burning barn, Thomas. While you were standing there, lost in your own head, that woman ran into the fire. You owe her the truth." The conversation ended there, but the words hung in Priscilla's mind like the smell of smoke that would not leave her clothes. About the war, about Margaret, about all of it. The fragments were beginning to form a picture, but the picture was still incomplete, and the missing pieces were the ones that mattered most. The truth arrived the next afternoon in the form of a large man on a big gray horse who rode up to the ranch like he owned it. Jack Dalton was in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered and thick-necked, with the bearing of a man who had once been someone important and had spent every day since trying to prove he still was. His clothes were expensive but not ostentatious, the kind of quality that whispered money rather than shouted it. His face was sun-darkened and hard-lined, and his eyes held the cold, appraising light of a man who calculated the value of everything he looked at and found most of it lacking. He tipped his hat to Priscilla with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Well, now," he said, "Tom Irving finally got himself a wife." "Afternoon, ma'am." Priscilla recognized him immediately. Not his face, but his type. She had grown up in Charleston, surrounded by men who wore their status like armor and wielded their charm like a weapon. Dalton was one of these. Smooth on the surface, dangerous underneath. Thomas came around the side of the house, and the change in his posture was immediate. His shoulders squared, his hands, which had been relaxed at his sides, curled into fists. His jaw set with a tightness that Priscilla had not seen before. Dalton turned his smile on Thomas, and the smile changed. It became something colder, something with edges. "Sergeant Irving," he said, and the military rank landed like a slap. "Heard about your barn. Shame, that. A man alone out here. Bad things happen. Of course, a man who fought for the wrong side in the war might say he is used to things going up in flames." Priscilla felt the temperature between the two men drop to freezing. This was not a neighborly visit. This was a declaration. Thomas said nothing. His jaw worked, but he held his silence. Dalton looked around the property with a proprietary air. "I have told you before, Irving. I am interested in buying this land. $500 for the whole spread. Good price, considering. The ranch is not for sale," Thomas said. His voice was flat and cold. Dalton sighed as though dealing with a stubborn child. "You are making a mistake. A man with a wife now has got more to lose, more to worry about. Might make him see things different." As Dalton turned to leave, he looked at Priscilla one more time, and the look crawled over her in a way that made her skin prickle. "Hope your new wife is tougher than the last one," he said. And then he was gone, dust swirling behind his horse's hooves, and Priscilla stood in the yard with those 5 words ringing in her ears. Tougher than the last one. She turned to Thomas. Her voice was so calm it frightened even her. "You were married before. Were you going to tell me, or was I supposed to hear it from the man trying to steal our land?" Thomas closed his eyes. When he opened them, the shame was back, the same terrible shame she had seen after the fire. He told her Margaret's name. He told her they had married in 1874 and that she had left in 1876. He said she could not handle the isolation of ranch life, the loneliness, the harshness of the frontier. He said she had gone back east, and they had not spoken since. He did not mention the nightmares. He did not mention the night he had struck her in his sleep. He did not mention the fractured arm. Priscilla listened to his account, the way she would have listened to a set of books that did not quite balance. The numbers were close, but they were not right. Something was missing. An entry that would make all the other entries make sense. She did not press him. She did not demand the full truth. Because she was hiding something too, and she could not demand honesty she was not willing to give. That night they lay in bed together for the second time, 2 bodies close enough to touch but separated by the distance of things unsaid. The darkness was absolute, and the silence between them was louder than any sound. Priscilla stared at the ceiling and added up what she knew. A previous wife who had left. A man who flinched from touch and froze during crises and screamed through his nightmares. A scar from a war he would not discuss. And a neighbor who addressed him by military rank with the contempt of a man who had fought on the other side. The columns were getting closer to balancing. But the final entry, the one that would make everything clear, was still hidden somewhere in the silence between Thomas Irving's careful words. Priscilla discovered that physical closeness could exist alongside emotional distance the way two rivers could run side by side through the same valley without ever merging, each one carrying its own current toward a destination the other could not see. 3 weeks after the wedding, the ranch had settled into a rhythm that was almost comfortable. Priscilla rose before dawn with Thomas because ranch work did not care about sleep, and the animals did not understand the concept of a morning off. She learned to collect eggs from hens that viewed her approach as a personal affront. She learned to pump water from the well with a technique that did not leave her shoulder aching by noon. She learned the names of the horses and the peculiarities of the cattle, and the 100 small details that made up the daily architecture of running a 200-acre spread. Thomas was a patient teacher. He explained everything twice without making her feel stupid, and he never laughed when she made mistakes, which was often in those first weeks. When she burned the biscuits, he ate them without comment. When she left a gate unlatched and 3 calves wandered into the vegetable garden, he rounded them up without complaint and only said that calves had a natural talent for finding open gates, and she should not feel singled out. But evenings were different. Evenings, Thomas retreated behind a wall she could not see, but could feel as clearly as the limestone walls of the house. He would sit in the rocking chair and stare at the fire with eyes that were present but distant, like a man watching something play out on the backs of the flames that no one else could see. He checked the door locks twice before bed, sometimes 3 times. And some nights, he did not sleep at all. She would hear him on the porch, the rocking chair creaking in a slow, steady rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat. One afternoon, Thomas decided to teach her to ride Belle properly. She had told him she could ride, and that was true. But she had learned on the flat, groomed trails around Charleston, and western riding in rough hill country terrain was a different animal entirely. He led Belle to the corral and helped Priscilla into the saddle, and then he stood beside her to adjust her posture. His hand rested on her waist to correct her balance. His other hand moved her knee into the proper position against the fender. He was standing close enough that she could feel his breath near her neck, could smell soap and leather, and the particular sun-warmed scent of his skin. The air between them tightened. She felt it, and she knew he felt it too, because his hand on her waist went very still. And for a long moment, neither of them moved and neither of them spoke. And the only sound was Belle's soft breathing and the creak of saddle leather. Then Thomas stepped back. He always stepped back first. He dropped his hands and moved away with a quick, almost jerky motion, and the spell broke. Priscilla was beginning to understand that this was not indifference. A man who did not want his wife would not stand that close, would not let his hands linger, would not have that particular tension in his jaw when he pulled away. Thomas wanted to be close to her. He was afraid of being close to her. And the distance between wanting and fearing was where all the silence in their marriage lived. She attended her First Lady's Auxiliary meeting on a Wednesday afternoon, riding Belle into town with a confidence that would have amazed her 3 weeks earlier. Annie Parker, the school teacher, met her at the door of the church meeting hall with the enthusiasm of a woman who had been starving for intelligent conversation. Annie was 24, sharp-witted and warm-hearted, with an easy laugh and a habit of saying exactly what she thought, which was refreshing in a world where most women had been trained to say what they were supposed to think. She taught at the Bandra schoolhouse, all grades in one room, and she loved her work with a passion that was evident in every word she spoke about it. "Oh, I am so glad you are here," Annie said, taking Priscilla's arm as though they had been friends for years. "You cannot imagine what it is like being the only woman under 30 in this town who has read a book that was not the Bible. I am sure the Bible is a fine book, but a person needs variety." Priscilla found herself laughing for the first time since she could remember. The auxiliary meeting was held in the church social hall, a modest room with plank floors and windows that let in the afternoon light. About a dozen women were gathered, ranging in age from Annie's 24 to Mrs. Prescott, who was 80 if she was a day, and who knitted through the entire meeting without once looking at her needles. The women were welcoming, but Priscilla noticed the whispers, small conversational eddies that formed and dissolved when she looked in their direction. She caught fragments. Poor Thomas, after what happened with Margaret. Well, she left for a reason, did she not? Priscilla pretended she already knew the full story. She nodded at the right moments and made sympathetic sounds, and all the while her mind was cataloging every fragment, fitting each one into the growing picture of what had happened in this house before she arrived. It was Mrs. Henderson who let the crucial piece slip. They were standing by the refreshment table, and Mrs. Henderson was telling Priscilla about the church social coming up the following month, and somehow the conversation turned to Thomas, and Mrs. Henderson said, in the casual, unguarded way of a woman who assumes everyone already knows the local history, well, of course, after Margaret went back east and told people he was a violent man, no woman in the county would look at him twice. It is a wonder he found anyone willing to come out here at all. The words hit Priscilla like cold water. She kept her face neutral, kept her voice steady, said something appropriate about how people's situations are often more complicated than they appear. But inside, the ledger was being rewritten. Margaret had not simply left because she could not handle ranch life. Margaret had left and told people Thomas was violent. And the women of Bandra had heard, and they had believed it. And that was why Thomas had been forced to advertise across the country for a wife. Not because there were no available women. Because the available women were afraid of him. On the ride home, Priscilla's mind worked furiously. She replayed every detail she had observed since arriving. Thomas flinching from touch. Thomas announcing himself before entering a room where she was. Thomas never raising his voice, never slamming a door, never making a sudden movement in her presence. This was not the behavior of a violent man trying to hide his nature. This was the behavior of a man who knew what his body could do and was terrified of it. A man who moved through the world with the exaggerated carefulness of someone carrying something explosive. And then there was the woman in Charleston. The woman with the arm in a sling and the empty eyes. Do not ever trust a Texas man. She had not given a name. She had not mentioned a town. The warning was general, almost vague, as though the woman was too ashamed to give details. But the timing, the injury, the description of a marriage that started well and ended in violence. Could it be the same woman? Could Margaret, Thomas's first wife, be the woman who had warned Priscilla in a Charleston churchyard without naming the man or the place? Could Priscilla be living in the house that woman had fled? The thought made her pull Belle to a stop on the trail. She sat in the saddle and looked at the ranch spread out below her, the limestone house and the repaired barn and the creek line marked by larger trees, and she tried to reconcile two contradictory truths. The rumor said Thomas was dangerous. Her own observation said he was not. Her instincts said he was a good man carrying something terrible, but her instincts had been wrong before. Her instincts had told her that William Montgomery was an honest man, a loving father, a person whose word could be trusted without verification. Her instincts had been catastrophically, devastatingly wrong about the most important person in her life. How could she trust her own eyes when they had already betrayed her? That evening, while Thomas was tending the horses, Priscilla found his Bible on the shelf beside the bed. She was not snooping. She was looking for something to read, and the Bible was the only book in the house. She opened it to the family register page, expecting to find the usual record of births, marriages, and deaths. Instead, she found a list of names, 17 of them written in Thomas's careful hand. Each name was followed by a date. All the dates fell within September, October, and November of 1863. Priscilla did not need anyone to explain what she was looking at. These were the men who had died beside Thomas Irving during the war. He had written down each name and each date, and he had kept this record in the most sacred book he owned. And Priscilla understood with a sudden, piercing clarity that this list was not a memorial. It was a penance. He was carrying these men with him, the way a man carries a debt he can never repay. She closed the Bible and placed it back on the shelf exactly as she had found it. That night, the nightmare returned. Priscilla lay in the dark and listened to Thomas begin to stir beside her. The sounds started small. A twitch, a murmur. His breathing quickening from the steady rhythm of sleep into something ragged and desperate. Then the words came, broken fragments of language that sounded like orders or pleas, and his body began to move, his legs kicking, his arms fighting invisible enemies. This time, Priscilla did not hide. She did not retreat to the far side of the bed. She lay still and watched and tried to understand what she was seeing, and she told herself she was not afraid because she had run into a burning barn, and she could handle this too. Thomas's arm swung outward. His fist caught her across the cheekbone. Not a full blow. A glancing strike, the kind that comes from a limb thrashing without direction or target. It hurt, a sharp burst of pain that brought tears to her eyes. But it was not the pain that made her lie motionless in the dark with her heart pounding and her face throbbing. It was the understanding. This was what happened to Margaret. Not a deliberate act of violence. Not a man choosing to hurt a woman. A man trapped inside a nightmare so real that his body fought battles his mind could not escape, and anyone close enough to touch became collateral damage in a war that had ended 15 years ago but would never really be over. Priscilla lay in the dark and pressed her fingers against the heat blooming across her cheekbone, and she understood now why Thomas flinched from touch, why he made his bed with military corners, why he checked the locks 3 times, why the rocking chair creaked through the night while he tried to stay awake so he would not hurt someone in his sleep. She was not afraid of Thomas Irving. She was afraid for him. But she also knew, with the cold clarity of a bookkeeper whose ledger has finally balanced, that he had brought her here knowing what he was. He had placed that advertisement and written those careful, honest-sounding letters and bought her a stagecoach ticket, all while hiding the fact that sharing a bed with him meant risking exactly what had just happened. He had taken away her choice, just like her father had taken away her choice by hiding the embezzlement until it was too late. She lay there until dawn, turning the decision over and over in her mind like a stone in her hand. Stay or go? Trust or run? Risk a future with a man who might hurt her in his sleep, or return to a city where her name was synonymous with shame, and her prospects were exactly nothing. Before she could decide, the bedroom door burst open, and Hector Garza stood there, his face the color of ash, his voice carrying news that drove everything else from her mind. 10 head of cattle dead in the night pasture, bellies bloated, eyes white. Someone had put strychnine in the water trough. Thomas knew before he opened his eyes. Not because of the familiar ache in his chest, not because of the sweat soaking through his shirt, but because Priscilla was sitting on the edge of the bed instead of lying beside him. The mattress was weighted differently. The balance shifted, and even before he was fully awake, his body registered the change the way a soldier's body registers any alteration in the perimeter. He opened his eyes. The early light was thin and gray, the sun not yet over the hills. Priscilla sat with her back to him, her spine very straight, her hands folded in her lap. She was looking at the wall. Not at anything on the wall, just at the wall, the way a person looks at something when they are actually looking inward. Then she turned, and he saw her cheekbone, and the world stopped. The bruise was not large, a reddish mark about the size of a silver dollar, already darkening at the edges, high on her left cheekbone where the bone was close to the surface. It could have been caused by a bump against a door frame or a stumble in the dark, but Thomas knew what had caused it. He knew with the same sick certainty that had greeted him on the morning, Margaret had stood in the kitchen cradling her arm and looking at him with the dead eyes of a woman who had just watched something precious shatter beyond repair. He had done it again. Thomas sat up. Then he slid off the bed and onto the floor, his back against the wall, his knees drawn up. And he put his face in his hands and said the only words that mattered. Now you know. This is why Margaret left. Priscilla did not move. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at him on the floor, and whatever she was feeling was locked behind an expression so controlled it was almost frightening. Thomas told her everything. He told her about the war, the boy who was 16 and stupid, and thought a uniform would make him a man. Chickamauga, the sound that Elijah Cooper made when the bullet tore through his throat. The way the Georgia grass was so green under all that blood, as though the earth was drinking it. The months that followed, battle after battle, a blur of smoke and noise and bodies, until the war ended and he went home and discovered that home did not exist anymore because the boy who had left it was dead, and the man who came back in his place did not know how to live in a world where people were not trying to kill him. He told her about the nightmares, how they had started during the war itself and never stopped, how he would wake up fighting, his body responding to threats that were not there, his fists striking at enemies made of memory, how some mornings he did not know where he was for 5, 10, 30 seconds. And during those seconds, he was not Thomas Irving of Bandra, Texas. He was Sergeant Irving of the Union Army, and every shadow was a Confederate rifle, and every sound was a cannon shot, and every person within arm's reach was someone who might be trying to kill him. He told her about Margaret, the girl he had loved in Missouri, the wife he had married in 1874, believing he could be normal if he just tried hard enough. 2 good years. Then the episodes worsened. He would lash out in his sleep, and Margaret would have to dodge. And some nights she would sleep in the other room, and the distance between them grew wider every week, until the night she was not fast enough. "I did not remember doing it," Thomas said, and his voice was raw. "I woke up and she was gone from the bed, and I found her in the kitchen holding her arm, and I could see it was broken. And she looked at me with this expression. It was not anger, Priscilla. It was not even fear. It was the moment she stopped believing I could be fixed. She left the next morning. Never said a word. Just packed her things and hired a wagon and was gone by noon. I never saw her again." He looked up at Priscilla from the floor, and his eyes were red-rimmed and steady and completely without defense. "I do not make excuses," he said. "I hit her even if I was asleep. Hit. That is the fact. And I placed that advertisement and brought you here without telling you what I am, because I was afraid that if I told the truth, no one would come. I took away your choice, and that was wrong, and I am sorry. If you want to leave, I will buy your ticket back to Charleston. I will not hold you somewhere you do not want to be." Priscilla looked at him for a long time. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut, vibrating with everything that hung in the balance. Then she spoke, and her voice was not gentle. It was sharp and clear and angry in a way that surprised them both. "You should have told me before I boarded that stagecoach. You should have told me in your letters, or at the very least you should have told me at the stagecoach stop before I got on your wagon. You took away my right to make an informed decision about my own life, and I will not pretend that is acceptable just because you are sitting on the floor looking sorry about it." Thomas flinched, but he did not argue. He nodded slowly and said, "You are right." Priscilla stood up and walked onto the porch. The morning air was cool, not yet weighted with the brutal heat that would arrive by midday. The prairie stretched out before her, dew still glinting on the grass, and the wildflowers along the creek were just beginning to open in the early light. Purple verbena, white daisies, the same flowers he had given her on the day she arrived. She thought about her father, a man who had hidden the truth until it destroyed everything. She thought about herself, standing on this porch with her own secret burning in her chest, the truth about William Montgomery and his embezzlement, and his suicide that she had not told Thomas, and did not intend to tell him any time soon. She was angry at Thomas for hiding his past, and she was hiding hers. The hypocrisy of that was not lost on her, and it did not make her less angry. It just made the anger more complicated. She went back inside. Thomas had not moved from the floor. "I am staying," she said, "but I have conditions. You will see Dr. Caldwell and tell him everything you just told me. You will not sleep in the same bed with me until we find a way to manage the episodes, and you will never hide anything from me again." Thomas looked up at her, and what she saw on his face was not relief. It was something rawer than relief. It was the expression of a man who had been carrying a weight so heavy he had forgotten what his body felt like without it, and someone had just offered to help him set it down. He put his hands over his face and cried. Not the silent, clenched crying she had witnessed on the porch. Real crying. The kind that comes from deep inside the chest and sounds like something breaking loose. Priscilla watched him and did not move to comfort him. Not because she did not want to, but because comfort was not what this moment needed. This moment needed truth standing in the open air, acknowledged and accepted and stripped of all its armor. Then Hector's voice came from outside, urgent and strained, and both of them were pulled from the raw landscape of their reckoning and into a different crisis entirely. Thomas. Hector appeared in the doorway, his hat in his hands, his face gray. "You need to come see the night pasture. We lost 10 head. Thomas was on his feet immediately. The transformation was startling. The weeping man on the floor was replaced in seconds by a man of action, his jaw set, his eyes clear, his body moving with the purposeful efficiency of someone who knew that livestock and livelihood did not care about personal crises. The soldier in him, Priscilla realized. The part of him that knew how to function under pressure because war had taught him that falling apart was a luxury the living could not afford. Before he walked out the door, Priscilla stopped him. "You are not the only one hiding something," she said. "My father did not just die in debt, but I am not ready to tell you everything yet. Give me time." Thomas looked at her. Something passed between them, an acknowledgement that they were both standing on ground that was not yet solid but was at least honest. He nodded once and went to deal with the dead cattle. Dr. Caldwell's office was a 2-room building behind the mercantile that smelled of carbolic acid and pipe tobacco. The doctor was a man in his 60s with white hair and steady hands, and eyes that had seen enough suffering to make them permanently kind. Thomas sat across from him in a wooden chair that creaked under his weight, and he told the doctor what he had never told anyone except Hector. He talked for nearly an hour. The war, the nightmares, Margaret. The episodes that came without warning, triggered by sounds or smells or shadows that moved in ways his sleeping mind interpreted as threats. The bruise on Priscilla's cheekbone that he had put there without knowing. Doc Caldwell listened without interruption. When Thomas finished, the doctor was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that changed the shape of everything. "You are not the only man I treat for this in Bandra, Thomas. There are at least 5 others. Men who fought in the same war and came home with the same affliction. The war did not end when the guns stopped. It just moved indoors." Thomas stared at him. 5 others, at least. Some of them worse than you. And I will tell you what I tell all of them. This is not a character flaw. This is an injury. Your body learned to survive in a place where survival required constant vigilance, and it has not learned how to stop. We cannot cure it, but we can manage it. Valerian tea before sleep will help calm the nerves. I will teach you breathing exercises, and you need to tell the people around you what to expect so they can keep themselves safe. Thomas left the doctor's office feeling lighter than he had felt in 15 years. Not healed, not fixed, but no longer alone with it. That evening, Priscilla sat on the porch and watched the sunset paint the hills in shades of orange and rust, and she turned over in her mind everything that had happened. Thomas's confession, his willingness to seek help, the conditions she had set and his acceptance of them, the partial confession she had offered about her own father, the door she had opened just wide enough to let air through without revealing everything on the other side. A figure on horseback appeared along the creek line, silhouetted against the fading light. Not Thomas. Someone younger, lighter in the saddle, sitting with the easy posture of a man who had grown up on horseback. The rider watched the ranch for a long moment, then turned and disappeared into the shadows beneath the trees. Priscilla reached for the rifle Thomas kept by the front door. She did not pick it up. But she placed her hand on the stock and let it rest there. A reassurance that the weapon was available if she needed it. In the barn, Hector sat alone in the dark, staring at a set of horseshoe tracks pressed into the soft ground near the poisoned water trough. The shoes had been fitted by a farrier who knew his craft, the work precise and distinctive. Hector knew those shoes. He had made them himself 3 years ago for a horse that now carried his own son. Hector knelt beside the carcass of the led cow and said in a voice so flat it raised the hair on Priscilla's arms, "Strychnine. Someone put it in the water trough." He did not say who. The grim set of his jaw suggested he did not have to. 10 head of cattle lay dead in the night pasture, their bodies grotesquely swollen, their legs rigid. The smell was already becoming unbearable in the morning heat. Thomas stood among the carcasses with his hands at his sides, and Priscilla watched something build behind his eyes that was not the empty dissociation she had seen during the fire. This was present. This was focused. This was rage. He walked to the fence line and hit a post with his bare fist. The crack of bone against wood was sharp and sickening, and Priscilla flinched. Thomas hit the post again, and again. By the third blow, his knuckle was broken, though he did not seem to notice. Priscilla went to him. She took his hand without asking permission and examined the damage. The third knuckle on his right hand was displaced, already swelling. She looked up at his face and said, "Anger does not fix fences. We need evidence." The words landed in the space between them, and Thomas stared at her with an expression that shifted from rage to something closer to shame, to something that might have been admiration. He let her wrap his hand with a strip of cloth from the kitchen, and he did not pull away from her touch. That afternoon, Priscilla asked to see the ranch's financial records. Thomas looked surprised. "I did not know you could do that." "My father taught me bookkeeping," she said, which was half the truth and would have to be enough for now. Thomas brought out a wooden box from under the bed. Inside were receipts, promissory notes, bills of sale, and a ledger that was more wishful thinking than accurate accounting. Priscilla spread the documents across the kitchen table and went to work. It took her 3 hours to understand the full picture, and the picture was worse than she had feared. Thomas Irving was an exceptional rancher and a terrible businessman. He kept impeccable records of his cattle, their lineages and health and grazing patterns, and almost no records of his finances. Money came in from cattle sales and went out for feed, supplies, taxes, and loan payments. And the difference between the two columns was not large enough to sustain the operation through a bad year. They were not yet in the red. But the margin was razor thin. Then she found the loan document from the bank in San Antonio, dated 4 months ago. $62 borrowed at 8% interest for the purpose of personal expenses. She cross-referenced the date with the stagecoach ticket receipt she found folded into the back of the ledger. Thomas had borrowed $62 from the bank to buy her stagecoach ticket and the fabric for a new dress that he had never mentioned. He had gone into debt to bring her here. Priscilla sat at the table with the loan document in her hands and felt something shift in her chest. Something that was not quite love, but was in the same territory. This man, who had so little and was at risk of losing what he had borrowed money he could not afford to bring a stranger into his life because loneliness was killing him as surely as any bullet. But the sentiment did not change the math. If they lost more cattle, the ranch would be bankrupt within 12 months. Priscilla made a proposal over supper that evening. She told Thomas, as diplomatically as she could manage, that his finances were in trouble. She suggested selling a parcel of unused grazing land on the western edge of the property to Samuel Drake, who had expressed interest in expanding his own spread. The sale would bring in enough money to replace the poisoned cattle and create a buffer against future losses. Thomas's reaction was immediate and visceral. "No. That land is mine. I cleared it and fenced it, and it is part of this ranch. It is a piece of ground that is producing nothing," Priscilla said, keeping her voice level. "Land has no value if we have nothing living on it. Pride will not feed us through winter," they argued. Not loudly, not cruelly, but with the real heat of two people who cared deeply about the same thing and disagreed about how to protect it. Thomas saw the land as his identity, proof that he had built something from nothing with his own hands. Priscilla saw the numbers, cold and unforgiving, and the numbers said the land was a luxury they could not afford. In the end, Thomas yielded, not because Priscilla overpowered him, but because her logic was sound, and he respected her enough to hear it. He did not like it. But he was a man who understood that survival sometimes meant letting go of the things you loved in order to save the things you loved more. "Good," Priscilla said. "I will draft the letter to Drake tomorrow." Thomas shook his head slowly. "I thought I was getting a wife. Turns out I got a whole bank." The ghost of a smile crossed Priscilla's face. "You got a bookkeeper." Close enough." Meanwhile, Priscilla was watching Hector. The old vaquero had been behaving strangely since the poisoning. He was quieter than usual. which was saying something for a man who already communicated primarily in grunts and meaningful silences. He disappeared for hours at a time, always with a plausible explanation, checking the far fence line, scouting for water sources, looking for signs of the poisoner. But his explanations came a beat too late, and his eyes moved a fraction too quickly when Thomas asked questions about the cattle deaths, and Priscilla's bookkeeper's instincts screamed that the numbers did not add up. One night she followed him. She waited until Thomas was asleep, the valerian tea from Doc Caldwell doing its work, and then she saddled Belle as quietly as she could and followed Hector's tracks north along the creek. The moonlight was bright enough to ride by, and Hector's trail was easy to follow in the soft ground near the water. 5 miles from the ranch, at a roadhouse called Buck's that sat at the crossroads of 2 cattle trails, Hector dismounted and went inside. Priscilla tied Belle to a mesquite tree and crept close enough to look through the window. Hector was sitting at a table with a young man in his mid-20s. The young man had Hector's dark eyes and strong jaw, and he wore the kind of clothes that said he was earning more money than a ranch hand typically saw. Luis Garza, Hector's son. The conversation was in Spanish, rapid and emotional. Priscilla did not speak the language, but she did not need to. The body language was universal. Hector was leaning forward, his hands spread on the table, his face a mask of pleading and pain. Luis was leaning back, arms crossed, his expression carrying the hard defiance of a young man who believed he had outgrown his father's advice. The exchange lasted 20 minutes. At one point, Hector reached across the table and gripped his son's forearm, and the gesture was so desperate it made Priscilla's throat tighten. Luis pulled away. He said something short and sharp, stood up, and walked out the back door. Hector sat alone at the table for a long time. Then he put his face in his hands. Priscilla rode back to the ranch and lay in bed, turning over what she had seen. Luis Garza, Hector's son, who had left the ranch 6 months ago for better pay. Better pay from whom? And why was Hector meeting him in secret, in the middle of the night, with the expression of a man who was begging for something he knew he would not receive? The answer came to her with a cold, slow certainty that felt like watching a column of numbers finally add up to the sum you feared. Luis was working for Dalton. Luis was the one who had access to the ranch, who knew the layout, who knew where the water troughs were, and when Thomas would be away. Luis was the spy inside the fence, and Hector had known. The next evening, Thomas knocked on the bedroom door. They had been sleeping separately per Priscilla's conditions, Thomas in the main room on a pallet near the fire, Priscilla in the bedroom with the door closed. The arrangement was functional but lonely, and both of them were feeling it. "I miss you," Thomas said through the door. His voice was quiet and rough, the voice of a man admitting something that cost him. "I know we have the agreement, but I miss you." Priscilla opened the door. Thomas stood there in his stockinged feet, his hair mussed from the pallet, his green eyes uncertain. She took his hand and led him to the bed. They did not make love. They lay together, her hands spread across his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat under her palm. His arm came around her, tentative at first, then settling into something that felt like shelter. This was the most intimate they had been. Not because of physical proximity, but because of what lay beneath it. He had told her his worst truth. She had not run. He was sleeping beside her not because the arrangement required it, but because she had chosen to let him back in, and both of them understood the weight of that choice. Priscilla listened to his heart and thought about what she knew, about Hector and Luis, about Dalton and the poisoned cattle, about the unsent letter to Margaret and the ring in the drawer and the 17 names in the Bible. And she thought about her own secret, the truth about her father that was still sitting in her chest like a stone, waiting to be either spoken or swallowed. A few days later, Priscilla rode into town for supplies. She tied Belle outside the mercantile and went inside, and she was comparing prices on coffee beans when she became aware of a conversation happening on the porch. A man's voice, unfamiliar, with the clipped accent of the eastern seaboard. "I am looking for a woman named Montgomery. She may have arrived recently from South Carolina, married a local man named Irving." Priscilla froze. The coffee beans blurred in front of her eyes. She set the tin down carefully on the counter and moved toward the window, and through the glass she saw him. A man in a city suit, dark fabric too heavy for Texas, carrying a leather satchel that screamed attorney. He was talking to Mr. Peterson, the mercantile owner, who was scratching his head and looking uncomfortable. Priscilla ducked out the side door and into the alley before the man could turn around. She pressed her back against the wall and forced herself to breathe. Her mind raced, and the conclusion it reached made her stomach drop. Dalton. Dalton had found her secret. He had hired someone to investigate her background the way a man might investigate a competitor's weakness, and he had found what there was to find. William Montgomery. Embezzlement. Suicide. A daughter who fled Charleston under a cloud of suspicion, and now Dalton had brought that truth to Bandra like a weapon. Because if fire and poison could not break Thomas Irving, perhaps shame could. She rode home fast, pushing Belle harder than she should have, and she was still half a mile from the ranch when she saw the city-suited man's horse tied to the hitching post in front of the house. He had gotten there before her. Thomas was standing on the porch talking to the stranger. When Priscilla rode up, Thomas turned to her, and his face carried an expression she could not read. Not anger, not yet. Something more complicated. Confusion and concern, and the first shadow of something that might become betrayal. "Priscilla," Thomas said, "this man says he has come from Charleston. He says he needs to speak with you about your father." There are moments when truth does not arrive gently like dawn. It strikes like lightning, and everything a person has built begins burning faster than a barn soaked in kerosene. The man's name was Whitfield. He was an attorney representing Hargrove and Associates, the firm William Montgomery had robbed. He was polite in the careful way of lawyers everywhere, and he needed Priscilla to sign a deposition confirming she had no knowledge of and no involvement in her father's embezzlement. That was the official reason he was here. The unofficial reason became clear when Priscilla realized what day it was. Sunday. And Whitfield had not come directly to the ranch. He had gone first to the church in town, where half of Bandra was gathered for the morning service. He had asked his questions there, loudly enough for people to hear. Someone had directed him to the Irving Ranch, but not before the essential information had spread through the congregation like fire through dry grass. William Montgomery. Embezzler. $3,000. Suicide by hanging. Daughter fled Charleston. By the time Whitfield arrived at the ranch, the town already knew. This was Dalton's work. Priscilla understood it with a clarity that was almost admirable in its cruelty. Dalton had hired investigators to dig into her past, and when they found what there was to find, he had arranged for the attorney to arrive on a Sunday at the church, when maximum damage could be done. If he could not destroy Thomas's ranch with fire and poison, he would destroy Thomas's marriage with shame. Whitfield was merely a tool, a well-dressed, well-spoken tool who probably did not even know he was being used. Priscilla signed the deposition with a hand that did not shake because she would not give Dalton the satisfaction. She answered Whitfield's questions truthfully and completely. No, she had not known about the embezzlement. No, she had not benefited from the stolen funds. Yes, she had discovered her father's body. Yes, she had left Charleston because remaining there was untenable. Whitfield thanked her, tipped his hat, and rode back toward town. And the silence he left behind was the loudest thing Priscilla had ever heard. Thomas did not speak on the ride from the porch to the barn to tend the horses. He did not speak while he unsaddled Copper. He did not speak while he filled the water trough and checked the feed bins. He moved through his chores with a mechanical precision that was somehow more frightening than shouting. Priscilla followed him and waited. When he finally spoke, they were standing in the barn, the late afternoon light slanting through the repaired wall, and his voice was quiet and controlled in the way that Thomas's voice was always quiet and controlled, which Priscilla had learned did not mean he was calm. It meant he was holding something very large inside a very small space. "Your father was a thief," Thomas said, "and he killed himself. And you came here without telling me any of it." Yes, Priscilla said. Thomas turned to face her. His green eyes were not empty the way they went during his episodes. They were full, too full, burning with something that was not rage but was adjacent to it. We made a promise, he said. No more hiding. I sat on that floor and told you the worst thing I have ever done, and I watched your face while I said it, and I accepted every word you threw at me because I deserved it. And the whole time I was doing that, you already knew your own secret, and you said nothing. Priscilla's throat tightened. The accuracy of the accusation made it impossible to deflect. I was not ready, she said. You were not ready, Thomas repeated. I was on my knees telling you about the war and Margaret and the worst night of my life, and you were not ready to tell me that your father was a criminal. He was not a criminal, Priscilla said, and her voice cracked for the first time. He was a weak man who made terrible choices and could not live with the consequences. There is a difference. Is there, Thomas said, and the word came out sharp enough to cut. Then he said the thing he should not have said, the thing that would haunt him for longer than any nightmare. Maybe you are good at hiding things because it runs in the blood. The words landed like a physical blow. Priscilla went very still. Her face drained of color, and the expression that settled over her features was worse than anger, worse than tears, worse than anything Thomas had ever seen on another human being. It was the expression of a woman who had feared this exact judgment from the first moment she set foot in Texas. And hearing it spoken aloud by the man she had chosen to trust was worse than any bruise he had ever given her in his sleep. Thomas knew immediately that he had crossed a line he could never uncross. The words were out, and they could not be taken back, and the horror of what he had done settled over him like a physical weight. He had sworn he would never deliberately hurt this woman, and he had just done it. Not in his sleep, not during an episode. Fully awake, fully aware, with surgical precision. He had found the most vulnerable place in her and driven a blade into it because he was hurt, and hurting her seemed like the only way to make his own pain smaller. He was not just the man who hit his wife in his sleep, he was also the man who could be cruel when he was awake, and that was worse. That was so much worse. Priscilla turned and walked out of the barn. She walked to the creek, to the place where the verbena grew wild along the bank, purple flowers nodding in the evening breeze. She sat on a flat rock at the water's edge and pressed her hands against her face and cried in a way she had not cried since the morning she found her father's body. She cried for her father, for her, for the lie he had lived and the cowardly way he had ended it. She cried for herself, for the girl who had loved a man she could not see clearly, and the woman who was afraid she would never see clearly again. She cried for Thomas and the terrible thing he had said, and the terrible truth buried inside it. The question of whether she was her father's daughter, in ways that went deeper than blood. She cried until she was empty, and then she sat by the creek and listened to the water and tried to think. Footsteps behind her. Not Thomas. The gait was different, heavier, slower, with the slight hitch of a man whose knees had seen too many decades of hard riding. Hector Garza lowered himself onto the rock beside her with the careful movements of a body that did not bend as easily as it once had. They sat in silence for a while. Then Hector spoke. "My son is working for Dalton," he said. His voice was steady, but beneath the steadiness was a current of anguish that ran so deep it seemed bottomless. "Luis is the one who poisoned the cattle. I have known for 2 weeks and said nothing. I was trying to protect my boy." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and painful and desperately honest. "Everyone in this place is hiding something," Hector said, "because they are afraid, afraid of losing what they love. You are afraid. Thomas is afraid. I am afraid. We are all hiding, and the hiding is killing us." Priscilla looked at him. This old, strong, weathered man who had spent his entire life on the back of a horse, who had survived droughts and floods, and the slow erosion of everything he had built, sitting beside a creek in the fading light with tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face because his son had betrayed the man Hector loved like a brother. "Thomas said a terrible thing to you," Hector continued. "That is a fact. But a man who says a cruel thing and immediately hates himself for it is a different creature from a man who says cruel things and enjoys the damage. You already know which one he is. The question is whether you trust what you know. The words struck Priscilla at the exact center of her wound. Trust what you know. The one thing she had been unable to do since the morning she discovered that everything she knew about her father was wrong. But Hector was right. She did know which kind of man Thomas was. She had known it since the moment he handed her wilted flowers with shaking hands. She had known it through the fire and the nightmares and the confession on the floor and every quiet moment in between. She had verified it with the obsessive thoroughness of a bookkeeper checking every column twice. The evidence was overwhelming. The evidence had always been overwhelming. The only thing standing between Priscilla and her own certainty was the ghost of a dead man's deception. She found Thomas in the barn, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall. In his hands was the gold ring she had found in the dresser drawer. The one engraved T and M, 1874. He was not wearing it. He was staring at it the way a man stares at a tombstone. "I am scared," he said without looking up. "I am scared that everything I touch breaks." Priscilla sat down beside him on the dirty barn floor. She took the ring from his hand. She stood up, and she threw it out the barn door into the gathering darkness beyond, where it made a small sound as it landed in the grass and disappeared. "That is the past," she said. "I am the present. And if you want a future, stand up and fight for it, starting with telling Hector that his son is the one feeding Dalton information about this ranch." Thomas looked up at her. The shock on his face was almost comical. "How do you know that?" he said. "Because I followed Hector to a roadhouse 3 nights ago and watched him beg his son to stop. Your foreman has been carrying this alone because he was afraid of losing both his son and the only man who ever treated him like family. He needs you to know the truth, and he needs you to not destroy him for it." Thomas stared at her for a long moment. Then he said, "When did you become the bravest person I know?" Before Priscilla could answer, the night split open with gunfire. 3 shots in rapid succession, echoing from across the creek to the south. The sound rolled through the hills like thunder, and birds exploded from the trees along the water, and somewhere in the distance a horse screamed. Thomas was on his feet instantly. His eyes were not empty. They were sharp, focused, present. The soldier in him, the one Priscilla had glimpsed during the cattle crisis, was fully awake now, and for the first time in 15 years the soldier was not an enemy but an ally. "That is Drake's ranch," Thomas said. He was already moving toward the tack room, reaching for his rifle and his gun belt. 3 shots is a distress signal. He is in trouble." Thomas looked at Priscilla, and something passed between them that was not a word, but was a promise. Then he was gone, swinging onto Copper's back, and riding hard into the darkness. 15 years after the war ended, Thomas Irving finally understood why he had survived. Not to forget the men who died beside him, not to punish himself for outliving them, not to spend every night fighting battles that were already lost. He had survived because there were people who needed him alive, people who were counting on the skills and instincts that the war had burned into his bones. And tonight those skills would not be wasted on ghosts. He rode hard through the darkness with the rifle balanced across his saddle, and the night air cutting against his face. Copper knew the trail to Drake's ranch and did not need guidance, which was good because Thomas's mind was already working 3 moves ahead. The way it had worked during the war when planning meant the difference between survival and slaughter. Drake's ranch was 3 miles south. The gunshots had come from that direction, 3 rapid shots, the universal distress signal among the ranchers of the hill country. Samuel Drake was a tough old man who did not signal for help unless help was genuinely needed. Thomas stopped at the Mercer place first, a mile from his own ranch. He pounded on the door until Frank Mercer came out with a shotgun and sleep-crusted eyes. "Drake is under attack," Thomas said. "Ride to the Patterson place and the Keller place and tell them to arm up and come to the creek crossing." Frank nodded once and was moving before Thomas had finished turning Copper back toward the road. By the time Thomas reached the creek that marked the boundary between Drake's property and the open range beyond, he could see lights moving in the darkness near Drake's house. Torches. At least 6 of them, spread in a loose arc around the main building like the fingers of a closing fist. A young rider came tearing out of the darkness on a lathered horse. Billy Drake, Samuel's son, 19 years old and white with fear. "Mr. Irving," Billy gasped. "There are 7 of them. Pa is holed up in the house, but he is running low on ammunition. They have been firing at the windows trying to force him out." "Who?" Thomas said, though he already knew. "Dalton, and his men, including one I did not recognize. Young fellow, rides good." Luis, Thomas thought, and the name sat in his stomach like a stone. Thomas sent Billy to meet the other ranchers at the creek crossing and rode on alone to scout the situation. He dismounted 200 yards from Drake's house and moved forward on foot, using the terrain the way the war had taught him, keeping to the low ground, staying in the shadows, reading the disposition of Dalton's men the way he had once read Confederate positions. 7 men, spread in a semicircle north of the house. Dalton himself was on horseback behind the line, directing the action the way an officer directs troops. The others were on foot, using trees and fence posts for cover, firing sporadically at the windows of Drake's house. It was not a coordinated assault. It was intimidation, designed to terrorize rather than kill, though the distinction was academic when bullets were flying. Thomas returned to the creek crossing and found 8 men waiting for him. Frank Mercer, Jed Patterson, old Bill Keller and his 2 grown sons, Samuel Drake's hired man, a steady fellow named Cooper, and Hector Garza, who had saddled up and followed Thomas without being asked. Thomas organized them with the efficiency of a man who had commanded soldiers in the field. He assigned positions. He gave clear orders. He told them to hold fire unless fired upon because he wanted this resolved without blood if possible, but was prepared for the alternative. "They are not trained fighters," Thomas told the group. "They are ranch hands and hired guns who have never faced organized resistance. If we present a united front, they will back down. Dalton is a bully, and bullies collapse when they meet something they cannot intimidate." Meanwhile, Priscilla was riding Belle hard toward Bandra. She did not ride to the sheriff's office. She had watched Roy Mitchell laugh with Dalton outside the saloon. She had noted his convenient slowness to investigate the arson and the cattle poisoning. She did not trust Mitchell to choose the law over Dalton's money, and she was not going to stake lives on a gamble she did not believe in. Instead, she rode to the telegraph office. The operator was a thin young man named Clement, who was not accustomed to being roused from bed by a wild-eyed woman on horseback demanding he open the office immediately. But something in Priscilla's face told him this was not a request he should refuse. She dictated a telegram to the United States Marshal's office in San Antonio. She reported the arson, the cattle poisoning, and the armed assault on Samuel Drake's property. She named Jack Dalton as the perpetrator and Sheriff Roy Mitchell as a compromised lawman who could not be relied upon to enforce the law. She requested that a deputy marshal be dispatched immediately. Clement sent the wire and looked at Priscilla with wide eyes. "Ma-am," he said. "That is going to stir up a hornet's nest." "Good," Priscilla said. "It is past time someone did." At the creek crossing, the confrontation unfolded. Thomas and his 8 men emerged from the tree line in a spread formation, rifles visible, torches of their own casting light across the open ground. The effect was immediate. Dalton's men, who had been firing casually at an undefended house, suddenly found themselves facing 9 armed and organized opponents who had materialized out of the darkness with the discipline of a military unit. Thomas stepped forward. His voice carried across the open ground with the authority of a man who had once commanded men in battle and had not forgotten how. "Dalton, this ends now. You are outnumbered and outgunned, and there is a wire on its way to the marshal's office in San Antonio. You can ride out of here tonight and take your chances with the law, or you can start a fight you will not finish. Your choice." Dalton sat on his horse behind his men, and even in the torchlight, Thomas could see the calculation happening behind those cold eyes. Dalton was not a coward, exactly. He was a former Confederate officer who had seen real combat and knew what gunfights actually looked like, which was precisely why he could see that this one would not go his way. But Dalton's pride was a bigger thing than his judgment, and pride made men stupid. "This is not your business, Irving," Dalton called back. "This is between me and Drake." "You burned my barn," Thomas said. "You poisoned my cattle. You threatened my wife. You made it my business the night you struck the match." From among Dalton's men, a young man stepped forward slightly. Luis Garza. He was holding a rifle, but his hands were not steady, and his eyes kept darting between Dalton and the tree line where his father stood among Thomas's men. Hector saw his son. The old vaquero did something that no one expected, and that would be talked about in Bandra for 30 years afterward. He handed his rifle to Frank Mercer. He stepped out of the tree line into the open ground between the two groups. And he walked toward his son, unarmed, his hands open at his sides, his boot heels crunching in the dry grass. Everyone froze. Both sides. 9 men and 7 men and a father walking toward his son across a space that might as well have been a battlefield. Hector stopped 20 yards from Luis. He spoke in Spanish, and his voice carried in the still night air. And though most of the men present did not understand the words, every one of them understood the tone. It was the voice of a father calling his child home. It was the oldest sound in the world. Luis's rifle barrel dipped, his face contorted. The hard, defiant expression he had worn at the roadhouse cracked like a mask that no longer fit, and underneath it was a boy who had made a terrible choice and was only now understanding the full cost. Luis lowered his rifle. He turned his back on Dalton. Dalton drew his pistol. The motion was fast, the reaction of a man accustomed to command who could not tolerate defection. He leveled the weapon at Luis's retreating back, and for one frozen heartbeat, the world balanced on the edge of a knife. Thomas fired, not to kill. Into Dalton's right shoulder, a clean shot that spun the big man sideways in his saddle and sent his pistol tumbling into the dirt. The report of the rifle cracked across the open ground like a whip, and the echo rolled through the hills and faded into the darkness. Thomas worked the lever and chambered another round and waited. His hands were steady. For the first time in 15 years, his hands were perfectly, completely, impossibly steady. The tremor that had plagued him every morning since Chickamauga was gone, silenced by a purpose that was larger than the damage. Dalton's men looked at their leader, bleeding and cursing in his saddle, and they looked at the 9 armed men facing them, and they made the sensible choice. They lowered their weapons. 2 of them turned their horses and rode off without a word. The others stood with their hands visible and their eyes on the ground. 20 minutes later, Sheriff Mitchell arrived. He had a talent for arriving after the worst was over, and he began the process of sorting things out in a way that was clearly designed to soften the edges of what Dalton had done. "Seems like a misunderstanding," Mitchell said. Maybe both sides got a little heated. Then Priscilla rode up on Bell, winded and dusty, and handed Mitchell a piece of paper. "Deputy Marshal will be here from San Antonio within 48 hours, she said. "I sent a full account of Dalton's activities, including the arson, the poisoning, and tonight's assault. I also mentioned your name, Sheriff, and your relationship with Mr. Dalton. I thought you should know." Mitchell's face went the color of old candle wax. Dalton, clutching his bleeding shoulder, locked eyes with Thomas across the moonlit ground, and what he saw there was not the nervous, trembling man who had greeted a mail-order bride with wilted flowers. What he saw was a man who had finally stopped running from the soldier inside him. "It is over, Dalton," Thomas said. In the aftermath, Hector held his son. Luis was shaking, blood on his shirt that was not his own, tears cutting tracks through the dirt on his face. "I am sorry, Pa," Luis said. Hector gripped his son's shoulders and looked into his eyes. "You walked the wrong road," he said, "but you turned around. That is the only thing that matters." Thomas watched them, father and son, broken and mending, holding on to each other in the torchlight while the hills stood witness. And something stirred in him that was new, a wanting he had not allowed himself to feel. The wanting of a man who suddenly understood that the future was not something to be feared, but something to be built, the way a house is built, one board at a time, with care and intention, and the belief that what you are making will outlast you. He mounted Copper and rode home. Priscilla was waiting on the porch. She was sitting in the rocking chair, the rifle across her knees, and when she saw him ride out of the darkness, she stood up and set the rifle against the wall and waited at the top of the steps. The moonlight caught her face, and Thomas saw that she had been crying, and he also saw that the crying was finished, and what remained was something fiercer and more permanent than tears. He climbed the steps. "I fired a gun today," he said. His voice was hoarse. "First time since the war. And I did not lose myself." Priscilla reached up and touched his face. Her fingers were cool against his sunburned skin. "Because this time you were protecting," she said, "not destroying." Thomas looked at her. In his eyes there were no ghosts, no empty spaces, no Georgia mud or cannon smoke or the face of a dying boy. There was only Priscilla, standing on his porch in the moonlight, steady as limestone and twice as enduring. "I want to be beside you tonight," he said, "and every night after." 6 months after she stepped off a stagecoach with a knife hidden in her sleeve, Priscilla Irving stood on the porch of her limestone and timber house and realized that this small place in the Texas Hill Country had become the thing that nowhere else on earth had ever been. Home. The deputy marshal arrived from San Antonio 2 days after the confrontation at Drake's ranch. He was a tall, quiet man named Callahan, who took statements from everyone involved with the thoroughness of a man who understood that justice in the frontier required paperwork, even more than it required a gun. Dalton was escorted to San Antonio under guard, charged with arson, willful destruction of livestock, and armed assault. He was tried before the state district court and sentenced to 12 years at the state penitentiary in Huntsville. His ranch was sold at auction by the county. Several smaller ranchers, including Thomas, purchased parcels at fair market value. The land Dalton had tried to steal through intimidation was divided among the people he had terrorized. Sheriff Roy Mitchell was removed from office by the county commissioners a week after the deputy marshal's visit. The word corruption was not used in the official proceedings, but everyone in Bandra knew what it meant when the commissioners cited loss of public confidence as the reason for his dismissal. Samuel Drake was elected to replace him. Drake ran the office the way he ran his ranch, with gruff honesty and a complete intolerance for nonsense. Luis Garza testified against Dalton in exchange for the county prosecutor declining to bring charges. It was not a comfortable arrangement for anyone involved, but it was a practical one, and in the frontier, practicality often trumped perfection. Hector and Luis began the slow, difficult work of rebuilding a trust that Luis had nearly destroyed. Thomas offered Luis a position back on the ranch, starting at the bottom, mucking stalls and mending fences, earning his way back one honest day at a time. "A second chance," Thomas said when he made the offer. "I understand the value of that better than most." The community absorbed Priscilla's truth the way the prairie absorbed a hard rain. There was disruption, of course. There were whispers and sidelong glances and the particular silence that falls over a room when the subject of the silence enters it. But Annie Parker came to the ranch the day after the church incident and sat on the porch and said the thing that needed saying. "My father drank himself to death. Mrs. Henderson's first husband left her for a saloon girl in Abilene. Doc Caldwell lost his medical license in Virginia before he came west and had to earn it back. Nobody in Bandra is without a shameful chapter, Priscilla. What matters is what you do next." What Priscilla did next was save the ranch. She restructured the finances with the precision of a woman who had been born to balance books. She sold the western parcel to Drake at fair price. She renegotiated the bank loan in San Antonio, presenting a 5-year plan that made the bank officer blink 3 times and then nod slowly, as though he had just been outsmarted by someone he had underestimated. She tracked every penny that came in and went out, and within 3 months the Irving Ranch was operating on a financial foundation that was sound for the first time in its existence. Thomas watched her work and shook his head in wonder. "I advertised for a wife," he said one evening as she sat at the kitchen table surrounded by receipts. "Pretty sure I got a whole bank instead." "You got a bookkeeper," Priscilla said without looking up. "Close enough." The skill that had failed to save her father saved her family. The bookkeeper's eye that had missed William Montgomery's theft because love had blinded it was now wide open. clear-eyed, and aimed at building something instead of unraveling it. Her wound had become her greatest strength. Thomas continued seeing Doc Caldwell. The valerian tea helped. The breathing exercises helped more. The nightmares did not stop, but they became less frequent and less violent. And on the nights when they came, Priscilla knew how to respond. She did not touch Thomas during the episodes. She spoke to him instead, calling his name from the safe distance of the far side of the bed, anchoring him to the present with the sound of her voice until his eyes cleared and his breathing slowed, and he came back to her from whatever hell his sleeping mind had dragged him into. Some mornings were harder than others. Some mornings Thomas woke shaking and silent and could not meet her eyes. And on those mornings, Priscilla made coffee and brought it to him on the porch and sat beside him without speaking, because she had learned that there were times when the most loving thing you could do for a person was simply be present and not require them to perform okayness when they were not okay. One afternoon, while preparing the small back room of the house for its new purpose, Priscilla moved a heavy trunk away from the wall and noticed that a board behind it was slightly loose. She pried it free and found, wedged into the gap between the boards, a piece of paper, a letter, in Thomas's handwriting, creased and worn, as though it had been folded and unfolded many times. She sat on the floor and read it. The letter was addressed to no one, or rather, it was addressed to someone Thomas had not yet met, a woman who might someday answer his advertisement, a woman who did not yet exist in his life, but whom he was already trying to reach. "I know I do not deserve to be loved," the letter read, "but if I do not try, I will die alone in this house, and maybe that is the punishment I deserve. Except I am not brave enough to accept it. So I am writing this letter to a woman I have never met, telling her what I am, hoping she will come anyway. I was a soldier. I fought in a war that broke something inside me that I cannot fix. I have nightmares that make me dangerous to anyone who sleeps beside me. I had a wife once, and I hurt her without knowing it, and she left, and she was right to leave. I am telling you this because you deserve to know before you make your decision. I am telling you because honesty is the only thing I have left that is worth giving. And I know I will not send this letter. I will write something polite and safe instead. And if she comes, I will try every day to be the man this letter proves I am not." Priscilla read the letter twice. Then she pressed it against her chest and cried. Not from sadness, from the aching, overwhelming tenderness of understanding a person completely. He had wanted to be honest from the very beginning. He had written the truth on this piece of paper and agonized over it, and folded it and unfolded it, and ultimately could not send it because his loneliness was greater than his courage. He had hidden the letter behind a board in the wall, close enough to find if he looked for it, far enough away that he could pretend it did not exist. She folded the letter and placed it back behind the board and pushed the trunk back into place. She did not tell Thomas she had found it. Some truths did not need to be spoken aloud to be understood. Some confessions completed themselves in silence. That evening, Thomas came in from the fields and found Priscilla standing in the small back room. She had been in there for an hour, measuring and planning, and when he appeared in the doorway, she turned to him with an expression he had never seen on her face before. "There is something you should know," she said. She took his hand and placed it on her stomach, still nearly flat, still giving no visible evidence of the change that was happening inside her. But the meaning of the gesture was unmistakable. Thomas's face went through a transformation that Priscilla wished she could preserve in amber. Confusion first, then comprehension dawning like sunrise across the hills, and then joy. Joy so fierce and sudden and overwhelming that it looked almost like pain, the kind of happiness that hurts because you did not know you were still capable of feeling it. He dropped to his knees in front of her and pressed his forehead against her stomach and wrapped his arms around her waist. And he stayed there for a long time. And when he finally looked up, his cheeks were wet and his green eyes were shining. "We are going to have a baby," he said, as though saying it aloud would make it more real. "We are going to have a baby," Priscilla confirmed. Thomas stood and kissed her, and this kiss was nothing like the careful, tentative kisses of their early days. This was a kiss that tasted like the future, like hope, like two people who had walked through fire and flood and the valley of their own worst fears and come out the other side still standing, still together, still choosing each other every single day. That night, they made love. Not the guarded, careful physical contact of the first weeks, but the real thing, the complete thing. Thomas let Priscilla trace the scar on his arm with her fingertips, and he did not flinch. Priscilla let him hold her close enough to feel her heartbeat, and she did not reach for the knife that was no longer under her pillow because she had stopped carrying it weeks ago. For the first time, his body beside hers felt like shelter instead of a potential threat. For the first time, her presence in his arms felt like permanence instead of a reprieve. The next morning, Thomas woke from a dreamless sleep, the first in 15 years. He lay still and watched Priscilla breathe. The morning light came through the window and touched her hair and her cheek and the curve of her shoulder. And Thomas thought, this is peace. This is what I was fighting for without knowing it. Not a piece of land or a herd of cattle or a house made of limestone. This woman, this moment. This stillness that does not require vigilance. This safety that does not demand a weapon. Spring arrived 3 months later with an extravagance that made even the longtime residents of the hill country stop and stare. The rains had been good that winter, and the prairie responded with a riot of color that stretched from horizon to horizon. Bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush and the purple verbena and white Blackfoot daisies that grew along every creek and fence line, and open meadow for as far as the eye could see. Priscilla sat on the porch in the late afternoon, one hand resting on the curve of her belly, which was now unmistakable in its announcement. The light was gold and amber, the sun dropping toward the hills, and the creek murmured to the south, and a mockingbird was singing its entire catalog from the top of the live oak tree near the corral. She heard hoofbeats on the road. Her pulse quickened, the reflex of months of threat, and she doubted it would ever fully leave. But then she saw the silhouette and recognized it immediately. Broad shoulders, straight back, hat tilted against the sun, Thomas riding Copper home from the far pasture, and in his hand something purple and white. He reined in at the porch, but did not dismount. He sat there on Copper's back, looking at her with an expression that moved across his face like weather across a landscape. Not the nervous uncertainty of the stagecoach stop, something deeper, something that had been tested and proven and was no longer afraid of itself. "What is it?" Priscilla asked. "Nothing," Thomas said. "It is just that every time I come home and see you standing there, I think the same thing." She stayed. She actually stayed. He swung down and climbed the steps and handed her the flowers. Purple verbena and white Blackfoot daisies, tied with a strip of leather, fresh from the meadow on his ride home. "I thought you should know what spring looks like out here," he said. The words were almost exactly the same as the first words he had ever spoken to her about the wildflowers, that day at the stagecoach stop when he was shaking, and she was terrified. And neither of them could have imagined standing here 9 months later, married, expecting a child, alive with a love that had been forged in fire and tempered in truth. Priscilla took the bouquet. She did not cry. She laughed. A real laugh, full and warm and free of fear. "I already know," she said. "I have been watching it grow." Thomas sat beside her on the porch, close enough that their shoulders touched. The stars began appearing one by one, bright and countless over the Texas hills, the same stars that had been there before either of them existed and would remain long after. "What are you thinking?" Thomas asked. She was thinking about a frightened young woman who had stepped off a stagecoach 9 months ago with a knife in her sleeve and a heart bolted shut with fear. That woman had braced herself for cruelty and received wildflowers and a smile. But what she could not have known that day, what no one could have told her, was that wildflowers do not last forever. They wilt. They die. Winter comes and the ground freezes hard as iron, but the roots remain beneath the surface, in the dark, waiting, and every spring they come back stronger, more vivid, as though winter had never happened at all. Love worked the same way. It was not something you found once and kept on a shelf. It was something you planted again every day, through pain, through truth, through forgiveness, until the roots ran deep enough that nothing on earth could tear them out. "I am thinking about roots," Priscilla said, "and flowers, and the fact that you still bring me weeds tied with leather and expect me to be impressed." Thomas grinned. The same nervous, hopeful grin from the stagecoach stop, older now but no less genuine. "Is it working?" he said. Priscilla took his hand. She laced her fingers through his. She settled against his shoulder the way she had done 100 evenings, and would do 1,000 more. "It has been working since the first day," she said. "You just did not know it yet." The stars came out in full, bright enough to cast faint shadows on the porch boards. The creek whispered in the distance. The horses shifted in the corral. Somewhere in the house behind them, a small room waited with a cradle Thomas had built from cedar, the same hands that had once shaken too badly to hold flowers, now steady enough to build a bed for his child. The wild flowers Thomas had picked that morning sat in a jar on the kitchen table, purple and white against the lamplight, filling the house with the scent of the open prairie. They would wilt in a few days. They always did. But out in the meadow, the roots were deep, and spring was here and the flowers would grow back. They always did. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.